just want to introduce our speaker to you. He looks just as he looks on the picture, as you can see, and his name is Reinhold Titus, and he currently serves with the OM ships as a Chief Strategy and Inclusion Officer. He holds qualifications in radiography, workforce diversity, strategic management, and a BA honors in biblical and intercultural studies, and an MA in intercultural leadership in global context. Reinhold initially studied and worked in the medical field as a radiographer. No, he was not a radio producer. A radiographer is those people who takes, let me not advertise it too much, but he does x-rays and all those things. And he joined one of the OM ships where he served as an advanced preparation in countries such as South Korea, Malaysia, South Africa, Namibia, and he has traveled over 50 countries, and he lived in 6 different countries in 3 continents. He has also, in all his traveling, kept his feet in both mission and the corporate sector. In missions, he served in various roles, including an Associate National Director of Operation Mobilization South Africa, OM, and Head of Leadership Development for OM in Africa, and led a team that designed and ran a global leadership development program for OM International. He also managed his own intercultural consultancy from South Africa, where he was speaking and facilitating training and coaching and consulting with corporate and faith-based leaders and teams and organizations on issues related to diversity, inclusion, leadership, and cultural intelligence. So from that background, you are aware who we have today. And he has recently finished his thesis, and therefore the title of his thesis was, or is rather, Fostering Globally Inclusive Missions Organizations. So Reinhold, I'm about to pray, and I want you to be free. May the Lord use you. Speak from the heart, speak from the text, however the Lord will allow you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Reverend Caswell, and to the rest of the SATS leadership for giving me the opportunity to share this research with you. This is the first time I'm presenting the research to South African, Namibian audiences. So really grateful for the platform, the opportunity. I've enjoyed over the last couple of months in particular, just getting reacquainted with SATS. I've watched a number of these symposiums that you're organizing, and I think it's an incredible resource for many of us across the continent and even in the diaspora as you reflect and as you change as an institution. So I'm really grateful for making this publicly available, the work that you're doing. When I started this particular research, this dissertation, this topic about 4 years ago, I happened to be at the institution where I studied, and during our lunch break, I sat across a lady from Latin America. I'd never met her before. It was the first time I met her. And so we got talking about our studies and research, and she wasn't sure what she wanted to research. And so she asked me, do you know what you want to research as part of your MA studies? And I said to her, well, that's actually the reason why I entered into this program, that I really feel God had called me to do this particular piece of research. So she asked me what it was, and I explained the research to her, the subject that I was wrestling with. And about 2 minutes or so after me starting explaining, and I finished, and I looked at her, and she just had this blank expression on her face. And I thought, maybe I didn't express myself so well. And so I asked her, did what I just explained to you make sense? And her response floored me. Her direct words was this: I want to cry. That's what she said. I asked her, what do you mean? And she said to me, Reinhold, what you have just described is exactly what I experienced in my organization. I'm about to leave the organization, but I've never been able to put into words what you have just described. I tell you again and again, when I do this kind of presentations throughout the research, as I was doing the interviews, and especially now over the last few months that I finished and I get invited into different spaces and organizations to present this research, this is a constant refrain. I don't know what it is, whether it be in academia or whether it be in the corporate world or in civil society or in mission organizations, even in multicultural churches. that when people hear this, there are people in those spaces with whom this particular research resonates. And maybe as we go through that, for some of you, it may make more sense. I know a number of you have read this. But really, it was wanting to explore this issue of inclusion in mission organizations. This is the space I found myself in for more than 20 years. I grew up in Namibia in South Africa. As I said, my mom is mixed race, or what we would say in that part of the world, colored. My dad is Xhosa. I was raised during the apartheid era, schooling. And of course, naturally, I have some sensitivity to these issues, especially even moving between my colored family and my Xhosa family in the Eastern Cape, and just seeing the differences there. I've lived in international spaces, and the more I engage in these spaces, the more this issue became a matter of urgency for me. So as I set off on the research, these were some of the questions that I was wrestling with. To what extent has global diversity and inclusion been given attention in what I term Western-founded global mission organizations? So these are organizations that operate globally, but they were founded in the West. So they've got a global footprint and membership today, but their roots were in the West. So to what extent has that been given? What progress has been made? And that was important for me, because we want to recognize that God is at work, that many of these organizations have changed. So sort of more appreciative inquiry type of questions to look at the progress and what has enabled that to happen. But also asking, what are the barriers to greater inclusion in organizations? And then thirdly, how can we further enhance this? So that's what I did. And as I started reflecting on this, reading literature, I found that from a sociological perspective, when you talk about diversity and inclusion, there's quite a big body of work, academically and even in popular literature, that's available. However, once you start digging deeper into the biblical perspective, it's a much smaller body of work that we have, that we can use to help us reflect. And then if we talk about a missions perspective, Western-founded global mission organizational perspective, there's even much less material on that. And then, of course, from a majority world, or some would term global South perspective, an even smaller body of work to actually help us reflect on this particular topic. So I identified this gap, and so that's really what I wanted to focus, recognize all of the other voices, but center the voices of people from the majority world in this research. Just for those of you in the academics amongst us, that's the methodology that I employed. Social constructivism, looking at the theoretical perspective. So it's a phenomenon when we talk about inclusion, and so that informed it. Methodology, ethnography, but also, and then using semi-structured interviews. And by the grace of God, I managed to find 11 African leaders, because of course with the master's research, you need to narrow it down. So I found 11 African leaders who were serving either as the CEO or one of the associate CEOs or international directors of 8 different mission agencies. So I spent on average 90 minutes with each one of these leaders from across Africa, South Africa, Cameroon, Nigeria, Kenya, from across Africa. I spent about 90 minutes with each one of them, and I had semi-structured interviews with them. Powerful, powerful, powerful. I said to this man and one woman that I wish I could release their interviews unedited. But of course, as you know, with ethical issues, I can't do that. But it was just powerful as they shared their own stories and perspectives. Autoethnography, so just that was a powerful method I've come to know over the years, and just a powerful way of helping me to use my own experience to reflect. And of course, as I said, I've always been a participant in these spaces, and so that's just from a methodology perspective. When we talk about inclusion, this is a framework that I found helpful from Ferdman, and he talks about inclusion being something that we need to start with on an individual level. So what is my experience of inclusion? But also understanding my own identity. I've talked to you a little bit about just my ethnic background, but there are many other aspects that have shaped me as a person and influences the way I perceive myself and I interact with others, and even as a child of God. So that sense of identity is important, and understanding ourselves. Though I would say, it's important that sometimes we think identity is something that I need to figure out on my own. For me, identity only makes sense in community, in conversation, that we understand who we are. But inclusion also needs to be fostered at an interpersonal level. So that's between two people. in any organization or institution, what people experience from somebody else in that organization can either enhance their experience of inclusion or exclusion. And so even in the SETS context, how we treat one another reflect on SETS. Often people would go to a certain space and they will come back and they say, these people are like that. But it might be because they've only interacted with one particular individual. And so we need to take a look at our behaviors, whether that actually contributes towards inclusion or not. And then, of course, in teams and groups, and this is when we talk about practices of teams, the norms, and our collective experiences. So what does it look like on team and group levels? I also want to say, though, that as we talk about this subject, as Christians, as followers of Jesus, these things ought to permeate all of our lives. So not just the institutions where we work. And so when I think about teams, I think about various kinds of teams that I'm part of. I would consider my family as a team. And so the question is, what does this look like in my family, or in your cell group, or in a sports team that you're part of, or whatever? So what does that look like? And we really need to make sure that that's permeates all of that. So just to give you an example in terms of team, and I have his permission, but my eldest son is 12 years old, and he's a ferocious reader, which I love about him. But a couple of years ago, I heard my son making a comment about girls, and I did not like the way that he was talking about girls. And so I had to reflect and ask myself, where did he get this from? Is it maybe that he picks up from me or somewhere else in society? Well, that's one question. The other question then was, as a father, how do I intervene? And because he loves reading, I said to him, listen, you can read your boys' adventure books, and some of these characters are, boys and girls, but there's some books that I need you to read every year, different kinds of books. And so the book that we chose to read together was a book called I Am Malala. If you remember the story of Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani girl who was shot by the Taliban, eventually got the Nobel Peace Prize. So she wrote a beautiful book, because I realized it was important for me as a father to center the story of a girl in my boy's life, to center the story of a girl from another cultural background in my boy's son's life, to center the story of a girl from another culture and another religion in my son's life. And we read this book together. Sometimes we'd sit on the stoop and he'd read a couple of pages out loud and I'd listen, and then I read it. And eventually we Googled, just the Swat Valley in Pakistan, because when I think of the Swat Valley, I hear Taliban and I have negative connotations. But Malala talks about her valley as being such a beautiful place. And so as we read and we Googled, even my mind started changing as I saw how beautiful it was. So all of that to say, whatever subject is what that relates to inclusion, we have to think about all of the spheres that we find in. How do we influence that? And then, of course, leaders and leadership are pivotal to this whole issue of fostering inclusion, and I'll say more about that later. And then the organizations, and this is where it comes to now policies, practice, climates, cultures, that is that needed to actually foster inclusion. And then, of course, societal levels. And so when I speak to audiences, particularly those of us from Namibia and South Africa and from the US, when we come to this conversation, we already come with a set of lenses because of how these issues have and continue to play out in our society. And so we have to recognize what we see in our society influences us. So the arrow on the right-hand side, we have been influenced by all of those. Even organizations, when we think about our churches or other organizations we've worked with, have shaped us as individuals in terms of our understanding and experience of inclusion. We've been shaped by all of those. But the arrow on the left-hand side, actually, we all can shape all of those spaces too. I can shape somebody else's influence, experience of inclusion, a team, organizations, and society. We can all make a difference. And so that's important. This particular research focused on the organizational level. So I'm attentive to all of those other issues, but this is what I wanted to look at: the policies, structures, systems, and processes, and how can we continue to foster inclusion on that level. So as we continue, I want to just give a few concepts and definitions just to frame what I talk about when I talk about inclusion. And again, this is select. My research is available for those of you who want to read it, but this is just a few select concepts before I talk about some of the findings and recommendations. One is diversity. Diversity really just refers to difference, all kinds of difference, whether race, national, gender, theological, even neurological difference is cognition. So it is just difference. And often we use this language of diversity and inclusion as two synonymous terms, but they mean different things. So that diversity simply refers to visible and invisible differences. When we talk about inclusion, and particularly on an organizational level, this is when we start recognizing that an inclusive environment acknowledges, welcomes, and accepts different approaches and styles, perspectives and experiences to allow all to reach their potential and result in organizational success. So it's about people becoming who God has made them to be, but also contributing towards the mission of the particular institution. Inclusion requires a deep understanding of the taken for granted ways, organizational assumptions, and other barriers that organizations and societies create exclusion. So there are ways that unconsciously that there are barriers that creates exclusion rather than inclusion. And so we need to have that surface and become aware of them so that we can address them. It requires us to pay attention to the strengths that we have in our organization that we can leverage to enhance greater inclusion. And then lastly, fostering inclusion includes radical changes in both the structures and the cultures, in their policies and practices, in the skills and styles of leaders, and the day-to-day interaction amongst all of their people. So if we are to foster organizational inclusion, we have to be attentive to all of those things and perhaps make radical changes if that is needed. There is no one globally accepted definition for inclusion. And so that is something that there are some, and one has to work with them and see what it means for you. But these are some concepts that underpins this whole notion of inclusion. And just, just again, to illustrate this, there's a difference between diversity and inclusion. Diversity focuses on the makeup of the organization, so how diverse, ethnic, gender, whatever we focus on. But inclusion, on the other hand, focuses on the extent of meaningful interaction of employees in the organization. So how deeply and meaningfully is everybody interacting in the organization and not just some? Diversity is a fact of life in work groups. It's just there that we have these differences. However, inclusion is grounded in what we do with their diversity. When we start valuing people and appreciating people because of and not because despite of their differences and similarities. So we start valuing and appreciating that. Diversity can be mandated and legislated, and we know this. We can tell you need to have so many people from this background and that background on a particular team or organization or leadership or board. That can be mandated. However, inclusion stems from voluntary actions. That requires people to make the decision to actually do that. Diversity focuses on increased recruitment of minorities. So who's absent, whose voices are we not hearing? Just get more of them into it. However, inclusion focuses on the removal of barriers to enable high performance from all employees. So it's not just get people in, but what barriers do we need to remove to make this happen? So there's a difference between the two, and I hope that helps as we move on. And then there's this whole concept of equality and equity, and you would have seen different versions of this picture, but I've chosen just this particular one to illustrate equity. So, and this is important in organizations. Equality is giving everyone the same regardless of need, and that picture illustrates that. But equity recognizes that we don't have the same starting point. And so if we want everybody to contribute, is giving people what they need and deserve in order to optimally contribute to God's kingdom or whatever the vision of the organization is. So it's important to understand the difference between equality and equity. Okay. And then just another piece that I found helpful as a concept as we talk about the findings. Within the space of diversity and inclusion, you'll often hear this whole belonging, and there's a lot of emphasis on belonging, and that is important. And belonging can be defined as the human need for close interpersonal relationships, fostered through opportunities for influence in decision-making, and also enabling access to information, resources, and networks. So the more we can do that, the more people feel included, the more they feel they belong. But there's something that I think has been perhaps not as much taken notice of, is the issue of uniqueness. That everybody is unique still. And so uniqueness is the need to maintain a distinctive and differentiated sense of self. So I know I'm different and I can maintain this. So to illustrate this for you, Shaw et al., a few researchers came up with this framework, which I think is incredibly helpful. So they talk about inclusion, both needing a space where you have belonging, but you also value uniqueness. And there's a continuum, as you can see on the horizontal axis. People can have a low sense of belonging in an organization, or they can have a high sense of belonging. On the vertical axis, an organization can have a low value of uniqueness or a high value of uniqueness. If an organization has a low belongingness and low value for uniqueness, then it leads to exclusion. And so exclusion is when there are groups or individuals within an organization who are not treated as an insider with unique value in the work group, but there are other members of the group who are insiders. So we clearly know those are the insiders in the group. They know how things are run. They are the ones who've got the power. They are the ones who make decisions. So we have low sense of belonging. People don't feel they belong, and their uniqueness is not valid either. We can progress and say, okay, let's just create a high sense of belonging, but still a low value for uniqueness. And that leads to assimilation. So this is when we treat groups or individuals as an insider. Now you become one of us in the work group organization when they conform to the organizational or the dominant cultural norms and downplay their uniqueness. So this is in a sense when people recognize they are different from the dominant one, but in order to participate in this organization or leadership or whatever, I have to leave my uniqueness at the door and come in and assimilate into the dominant norms and form. That is not inclusion either. So we have high belonging. I feel like I'm one of you, but there's a part of me that I've left at the door. But then we can get to a space where there's low belonging, but a high value for uniqueness. So this is differentiation. And this is when individuals or groups are recruited, but they're not treated as an organizational insider. You don't belong. You don't have access to resources and the decision-making and all of that, but we want you there because we recognize your unique characteristics and they are seen as a valuable and required for the organizational success. So we want to branch into a new market, whether it be ethnically or gender or generational. And so we recruit somebody from their particular demographics into our leadership or team. And we say, we want you to help us give insight into that particular demographic so that we can reach those people. So we use the unique insights, but actually there's still another group that's the insiders that holds all of the power. That is differentiation. That's not inclusion. Inclusion is when individuals and groups are treated as an insider and also encouraged to retain the uniqueness within the work group. So we embrace both. So that's helpful. So as I spoke to the people that I interviewed, and of course, if you read the research, broad reflection and reading from across the world, but I asked these leaders about just how they would conceptualize some of these terms. So these are some of these terms that so they talk about belonging, and where you see the quote marks, these are direct quotes from the research, from the interviews. I've not grammar checked them or changed them. I just wanted them as they spoke. So they talk about belonging in the organizations as a space where everyone feels equally welcomed and valued for who they are, what they contribute. They talk about being family, enjoying koinonia, that deep sense of fellowship, being at home because you belong in this organization. And then one leader says, and I quote, "I've been around organizations and even sometimes my own organization where you almost feel like an outsider." So they recognize what belonging is, but that they've not always felt that way in organizations. And this is one person. Then they talk about representation, the need for representation in order to foster inclusion. So I asked them, what do they mean by that? They said people from different demographics, especially so in the organizational leadership and board levels, that we need to have people represented. Now, my argument is diversity for me is not the end goal. Inclusion is the end goal, and I'll talk about that. But you need diversity in order to be able to foster inclusion. If you even don't have people from different demographics, how are you going to hear those voices? And so this is what they're talking about. But then they talk about not just representation when they are there, but voice. So they say voice, representation, whether on leadership teams or board level, does not equal to transformation. It comes down to, do you have a voice when you're in those spaces? And then they talk about decision making. And I ask them what aspects of decision making, and they say involvement in organizational decision making throughout the planning, the organizing, and the implementing phase. And there's a sense of, that minorities or subordinate groups are only brought into decision making and planning when we get to the implementation phase. But it's the insiders who does the planning, and maybe even they might be brought into the organizing phase, but the planning in particular, that they're often not there. So they say people need to be part of all of that whole process. And then they talk about the need for access. So I ask, access to what? They say access to decision making, access to power, access to resources, while another stated all aspects of leadership within the organization. So these were some of the ways that they talked about inclusion. So when I asked them why this is so important, and so we looked at the biblical perspective, they gave essentially 4 reasons: the biblical imperative, the missiological imperative, strategic, and personal. And so just briefly, when they talk about the biblical, and again, a mixture of their views and just some of the research and theory, is when we think about inclusion, it really starts with God. It is not about being politically correct or anything like that. If we think about the Trinity, 3 persons in one, distinct with their own function, and yet one Godhead whom we worship. So even in the Creator, and then in his creation, we see this. So Jesus talks about the Father being in me and the Holy Spirit, and we speak into being. And then we see Genesis 1 creation. God creates day and night, heaven and earth, the sun and the moon, seeming opposites, but meant to function as one. We have this beautiful picture in 1 Corinthians 12 about the body of Christ, distinct, different, and yet only together can we fully be the body of Christ under the lordship of Christ. The nations, Paul says, from one man he created all the nations. So I see this as this incredible dispersion of God amongst the nations. And then in Revelation 7 verse 9, the scripture that we know so well, he says that one day there will be a people from every tribe, every tongue, and every nation worship before the throne, dressed in white robes. If diversity wasn't important to God, why does the Bible not just say they will be dressed in white robes? Then it would have created this image of uniformity and conformity. But no, God tells us that even in that day, in that time, we will recognize our uniqueness and celebrate that uniqueness. So often we see diversity as a problem. It was never meant to be the fall and sin, but it was always a demonstration of God's amazing creative intent and expressed in his creation. Of course, when we look at this, as I said, there's a lot of work from a sociological perspective, but when we critique it from a biblical perspective, we have to recognize that all of us have fallen. Not just one group, all of us have fallen. And that has led to enmity in the diversity of God's creation. There can also be a concern that when we talk about inclusion, does it mean all things goes? Everything is included? No. I think the author of Exclusion and Embrace talks about it, Miroslav Volf. And he says, he talks about boundaries. And he says, the absence of boundaries doesn't mean inclusion. It means the end of life. So any organization needs to have boundaries. And often those boundaries are clear in terms of our mission or vision statement, our statement of faith, our values. It says who we are. But I would also challenge organizations to be willing to reflect on those issues that creates the boundaries. Because as I looked at it globally, sometimes those boundaries have been created in a specific era by a specific group from certain demographics who sat around the table and did the best they could at the time. But does that still reflect who and what our organization ought to be today? So it doesn't mean the end of boundaries, but it does mean that we were willing to examine our boundaries and adjust if need be. But it also doesn't mean everything goes. And I know there's lots of debates around different aspects of inclusion, but we need to reflect on this critically as Christians. And then missiologically, just the growth of the church, we know, recognizing a global space, we can no longer ignore the majority world church because it is the majority. Gender, women in God's mission, again, just the fact that as I was looking for participants of the research, I found 10 African men who participated, and I could only find 1 woman in that particular space. That is data. And we need to ask ourselves questions as to what lies behind it. Generationally, I just look at where I'm at in Germany at the moment. The average age in Germany is 45.7 years. The average age in Kenya is 20.1 years old. What does this mean for us to reflect on this generationally, what God is doing? And so we have to be attentive to this. Otherwise, we're going to miss what God wants to do and He's doing in the world. And then just from a strategic organizational point of view, if we do this and we do it for the right reasons, we can attract more diverse and skilled people. Many people, when they look at organizations, they look at, they go online, they look at our board, our leadership, and they already ask the question, will I belong there? But I said we need to do it for the right reasons, not just merely to attract people, but because we believe this is the God thing to do. When people belong and they can contribute their uniqueness, there's increased engagement, there's increased trust. We gain new perspectives. Innovation happens as we pay attention to this. We retain people because people are less likely to move because they don't feel that they are being heard or being included. And it improves the performance of organizations. So just the strategic value of this is it contributes to the mission and the vision of organizations. And then I mentioned that personal, but just we all know just how much we've learned and grown over this. So as I asked participants about barriers to inclusion in our organizations, these are some of the things that they've said, some of the highlights. And let me just quickly give you some quotes about some of these issues that they identified. They say the superiority issue, they say, by nature of being founded in the West, there was already a sense of who will be leading whom. They talked about organizational norms and standards and structures and processes developed from a particular area and reinforces the views of superiority and inferiority. So there was a sense of the superiority mindset, and those of you who've read it, I tie it with a whole sense of whiteness, which really centers Western histories and cultural expressions as normative and the ultimate form of maturity to which others must aspire or be molded into. And so we have to look at our organization and say, is this a present, this issue of superiority, and how does it manifest? They talked about inferiority. And so somebody says, particularly for us from the majority world as Africans, somebody said, because if the message had been for us for such a long part of our lives, that Africa is the dark continent, Africa is to be helped, Africa is to be pitied, Africa is to be educated. Sometimes we believe those. And he says about himself, it took me a while to overcome that sense of inferiority. They talk about silencing of voice, the fact that they don't always get the space to express their own views in these spaces due to a lack of representation. And then I asked somebody to explain this to me. He says, inclusion means that your voice is as valid as mine. Not that it is valid when you say what I want you to what I want to hear. It is valid when you say what you really think. Inclusion means that I will respect that voice and I will take that voice into consideration. It will influence the decisions that we make. So they talk about money and mission models, just how that plays out, paternalism, ownership, who owns, who can spend money, dependency, some of those issues around money and the model of missions that we have in terms of support raising and even what is missions and who can be a missionary. I continue to be surprised to hear thoughts around, some indigenous people or local people not being considered as missionaries, but only the expats in certain contexts. They talk about a lack of understanding and intentionality. That one person said there's not enough reflection and meditation on the passages of scriptures that talks about inclusion. And another one in terms of intentionality says, it is one thing to express your intentions for change. It is another thing to make that change happen. They talk about leadership, and so this is a quote. They say spiritual leadership is considered as only coming from the West, or when it is exhibited in a Western context, dressed in a Western garb, with Western cues, dynamics, and styles. But spiritual leadership from another context is not considered to be one that meets the standard or the threshold. So how we see leadership is a part of it. And then the insecurity of fear, insecurity from those who perhaps feel inferior, the fear for those who always had power, the binary mindset that if we talk about inclusion, it means there's no more space for people like me. And so that came up in the research. So these were some of the barriers that was identified. When we talk about and just trying to understand what was the elements that actually helps to foster inclusion in an organization, not surprisingly, leadership is at the top of it. And somebody said, leadership needs to have a vision for it. That's the first thing. Without leadership that is intentional, without leadership that promotes it, talks about it, grows it, nurtures it, it won't happen. And they talk about leadership on board levels, on leadership team levels, and in work groups, that needs to be present there. I love the one where they talked about collective spiritual discernment, and it's already been identified that we have not done enough theological, missiological, biblical reflection on this particular topic. But they say, bottom line is, if our diversity doesn't point to Christ, then maybe it's not worth it. It has to be about the glory of God. So fresh missiological and theological reflection that takes the voices of the minority or subordinate groups seriously is needed to create new paradigms. So an enabling environment where there's mutual respect, where there's trust, where there's a sense of interdependence, where we can hold divergent views. And so we often talk about in the inclusion space about an inclusive climate, an awareness that things are not right, and a need to acknowledge that we have a problem, a conscious awareness of the contributions of those who were not in the spaces in the past. And I think I can go on and on, but just an awareness of the need for this, awareness of other people, and awareness on how to address it. They talk about supporting systems and structures and processes that ultimately we need to embed this in our organization. So whether it be HR or financial policies or whatever policies we have, but managers and management needs to become part of this to ensure it's embedded and that we actually transform this. And I'm leading this work in a particular organization, and so I recognize how important that is. And then just measurement. We have made progress, and we need to celebrate that, but also pay attention to how do we track whether we're actually making progress, not just in terms of diversity dimensions, but actually becoming truly inclusive. So that helps us to track. And then just as I conclude, some recommendations. I recognize at the end that somehow we are talking about these things. Many of you would recognize this. Often we are together in these spaces as diverse teams or in meetings, and certain issues are being talked about, but there are often elephants in the room that we don't talk about. And when we walk out of the room and we are amongst our affinity group where we feel safe, then we talk about it and say, oh, did you hear that? Oh, what about that? But somehow we're not able to have those conversations in the room. Why not? And I'll talk about that now. But also the inclusive leadership. So this is just what I mentioned here, that somehow we need to be able to have these conversations, and it needs to lead to change. And I believe this is important from a biblical perspective. As I read the scriptures, God speaks. God in conversation engages with his people and transforms. And even when these issues came up in the early church, you remember in Acts about the inclusion of the Gentiles, just the conversations that needed to take place. Even the widows that had to come to the leaders and say, hey, this is not right, and leaders had to engage with this. So we see this in a biblical way as well. But also as we look at organizational change, there was this sort of Newtonian approaches to change. But we recognize more and more in the world today that we deal with so much complexity, and somehow we need to find new ways of change within organizations. And one of those are more and more the whole conversational approaches to change. And then just as an African, we are oral cultures. We know we like to talk. We like to have our indabas. But that is part of just culturally, it's already embedded within us to leverage that and for conversations that leads to change. I've included in the research just some of the key themes that came up that if we're going to have those conversations that we need to talk about, but just for the sake of time. If we're going to have real inclusive conversations that leads to change, one of the reasons why it's not happening is because the conditions are not right for them. And so these are just some that I suggest that we need to address if we're going to have these conversations. One is organizational commitment. I speak to many people, and people are tired. People say, not in another conversation. And then we walk out of the room and nothing changes. People are willing to engage in the conversation if we are committed to really change. And so organizations need to be committed to this. We need to define what we mean with inclusion in our context, or even if we use a different term, but what do we mean by that? We need to be willing to allocate the resources for that in terms of manpower and money, space to reflect theologically or otherwise, but organizational commitment. Without this, the conversations will be futile. But also, just the space for grace and forgiveness in these conversations. As we know, mistakes have been made and mistakes will be made. And so the only way that you and I can continue to maintain our relationship with God is because he extends grace and forgiveness as we pray, as we engage with him daily. So when we have these conversations, we've learned this from our history in South Africa, is the need for grace and forgiveness as we journey together as brothers and sisters. And then I talk about safety and courage. We somehow need to create that psychological safety, and this is the work of organizations and organizational leadership, that people can turn up authentically themselves. So that psychological safety is important. But on the other hand, for some of us who've been in the spaces for a long time, sometimes the spaces is not safe. And we have to say, like an Esther, my people are about to perish. If I don't speak up, that's going to happen. And if I perish, but I have to. For such a time as this, God has us in those spaces. And so sometimes, my brothers and sisters, even when it's hard, we have to do this. One of the encouraging things that I found in my research is that a lot of the change that has happened in some of these organizations is not always been because of the Africans or the minorities. Sometimes it's been because of white leaders recognizing this and pushing this. I work with an organization right now where I do some work with them, and they are led by a German. It's an international organization. He is the one pushing for this, advocating, putting systems and structures and pros in place for this. But we need to have the courage to do this work. We need to talk about power. Where does power lie in our organizations? We have to recognize the issues of inequity when we come to this conversation. Even when it comes to language, and some people cannot express themselves so well in English, we have to talk about the boundaries. Who determines the boundaries of the conversation? If it is the dominant ones, then we're just going to end up in the same place. So we have to explore all of those issues. And then just leadership. We have to focus on investing in more inclusive leadership, which means there are people from all demographics involved in that, and we develop them. As I concluded my research, my supervisor suggested that because I've been centering the voices of people from the majority world, and particularly Africans in my research, he suggested that I give a copy of my research to a Western leader, somebody whom I know. So I gave this friend of mine, Andrew, the copy of the research. He read through it, and then we had a moderated conversation. But prior to the conversation, he had to write a 2-page reflection, and I had to write a 2-page reflection about the conversation we were about to have. And then the two of us, with my supervisor, got onto a 90-minute conversation, and then we talked about this. And at the end of the conversation, we both wrote a 2-page reflection again. That is attached as a summary of that is attached as an appendix. That was powerful to have that conversation with him, because the research had challenged him. The research had caused him to think. And he even acknowledges that 2 years ago, he would not have been able to have the conversation with me. And I also said, I'm not sure he would have been open to have the conversation 2 years ago. So something has happened. God is busy doing something that draws attention to the need for us to have this conversation. But one of the things that Andrew did is, as we were talking, he proposed this model. And he said, when it comes to leaders, we need to ask ourselves the question, if this is all true, or at least some of it, how then shall we learn? Not just to walk away. And he said leaders are in 5 different places. Some don't know about these issues and don't care. Others know, but don't care. So the urgency is not elevated. And then on P3, it says some leaders know and care, but not ready. So the courage gap is too big for them to take the step. Then at P4, they know and care and ready, but don't know how. And P5, know, care, ready, and equipped to do that. He says about himself, most of my leadership life has been P2, know but don't care. I am not alone. How do we identify where leaders are at and take them on the journey? What is needed to get someone from P2 to P3? Where do we focus our attention? So the investment on leaders. Let me just conclude with this quote. This was a quote from one of the participants in the research, and this is the final paragraph in my dissertation. And he said, when we talk about this journey towards inclusion, I know it is hard. None of this that I've talked to you about, I do not consider it to be an easy thing to fix, to achieve. And I know it is very, very hard. But one thing that causes me to press on is that I know that whether in my generation or not, whether in my time or season of leadership or not, as long as we pursue these things, they are deeply theological and missiologically grounded. Therefore, they warrant being pursued. We need to pursue them, whatever happens. And that's what really keeps me going. If I were to just look at the difficulties of the hard work, it would be easy to be discouraged. But because I'm convinced of the theological and historical and even the strategic value of it, I just say to myself, it is the way to go. Thank you, Caswell.